I mean, I'm reminded of one of these statements that my mentor, Dr. Bernard Lown, used to make, which I think is sort of illustrative of his absolute genius. And what it was he said, in most areas of activity, efficiency translates as doing the same thing in less and less time. And he would say, but in the practice of medicine, efficiency increases the more time it takes.
Hello and welcome to Clinical Changemakers. Today on the show we have Dr. Vikas Saini. He is a cardiologist, published researcher, and president of the Lown Institute. Dr. Vikas Saini, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Now, I'm really excited to talk to you about all the work that you've been doing at the Lown Institute, specifically around the Social Responsibility Index, as well as your expertise and knowledge in the overuse or low-value healthcare space. But before we do, I understand that you have a background in philosophy, and I wondered, when you reflect back on that training and that education, how has that influenced your approach to healthcare and perhaps some of your worldview?
I've had occasions periodically to think about, what did majoring in philosophy do for me? Because at the time, of course, my parents were thinking, this is a useless thing you're learning. I guess what I would say about it is that I have a willingness to have a more theoretical bent. And what philosophy did, I think, for me, was it allowed me to think about thinking. By doing that, it allowed me to see that frames of thinking, are multiple and they're variable. And there are many different ways of kind of construing both a problem and even a systematic set of problems. And in that sense, I think it allowed me a kind of flexibility, or dare I say, kind of suppleness in thinking about problems in healthcare. So, for example, I know we'll talk more about the issue of low value care, but if you imagine that there are sort of constructs or theoretical frameworks with which people experience the world, then it's not so hard to understand why there would be certain styles of practice or ways of even construing the evidence or interpreting the evidence that would lead to the variation we see. And so I think that was one of the two things I'd say philosophy gave me an appreciation of that. And then the second is, just a little more the actual discipline of trying to think clearly and trying to make razor sharp distinctions. Just that thing, but that done conceptually, I would say is one of the things that is about as general a form of intellectual capability as I could imagine, applicable anywhere, anytime, in any setting, whether they're group settings or various ways. Philosophy didn't prepare me necessarily for talking to patients, right? There's a whole dimension around clinical style and care that philosophy didn't prepare me for. But what it certainly did do was help me learn the value of being more precise and also strive to be more precise. And everything I'm saying, by the way, I don't pretend to have gotten very far, but it certainly was very helpful to point me in that direction.
What I'm hearing in that first point is there's a proverb or a saying about, two fish swimming along and they bump into another fish, and the other fish says to this fish that they've just met, says, how's the water? And those two fish look at each other and go, what's water? So what I'm hearing is that ability to kind of step back, see a system and start to scrutinize it. Whereas often in medical fields, we can get narrower and narrower in our specialities and our focus, and we see that domain as the entire story. But what I'm hearing is you were able to be equipped with some tools that enabled you to step back and scrutinize that whole system. I've heard you also say that healthcare is a moral and scientific enterprise. What did you mean by that?
Being a physician requires you to be familiar with science appreciate science both for its strengths and its inadequacies. And so practicing medicine requires a scientific approach, but it is not actually science. It is more of a humanistic endeavor. And it's impossible to be a good physician without engaging, with your patients, with families, with your team and colleagues, but particularly your patients. It's impossible to engage with them without understanding the kind of deeper emotional reasons or emotional framework around which this dyadic encounter is actually occurring. And so you have to be aware of that. In addition, I guess I would say, and again, this applies a lot to the issue of low value care, is that when we know something or when we think we know something fairly well, and we have a scientific basis for thinking that, that may guide some of our decision making. But there are many, many things that we simply don't know and cannot know yet. And maybe at some date in the sort of indefinite future, we'll know everything there is to know. But but at no point can we ever pretend to have that sort of omniscience, godlike omniscience. And so there's always a level of uncertainty. And one has to start making decisions in the face of uncertainty. And so one of the yardsticks is what we know, but another yardstick has to be, what is our ethical stance? What is the basis around which we're making these decisions? The central tenet, or really the defining feature of being a professional, is to be at the service of somebody else. You apply your knowledge, your skills, everything at the service of somebody else. And so it is fundamentally an ethical position, and therefore, the enterprise, if you will, to use a commercial term, the enterprise of medicine has both scientific and moral dimensions, and they're inextricably bound.
I'm hearing a lot in that around humility, humility to know what areas we do know and don't know, and be honest and open about those areas. I would also be curious to touch on perhaps the history of the healing profession and how that has changed. When you were talking about the two pieces there, the two complements, the moral and the scientific, a decade ago when I was first starting out, I would have, my 50-50 would have actually been so much more in the scientific realm. It is rigidly, almost mathematical in the approach that we apply the science of medicine. And through my career as practicing, I've so much more softened to the idea of it being a humanistic enterprise still. So when you go back into start thinking about history of healing, how do you think that evolution has gone? And have we started to sort of drift, or do you think we're sort of coming back to those core principles you've mentioned?
In the United States, for example, when Abraham Flexner issued his report in 1910 saying that the teaching in American medical schools was not sufficiently scientific, one of the shortcomings was that we had too much. I don't know that he ever said it, but we had too much quackery. But remember, in those days, America was, it was obviously a rising power in the world. It was obviously a big economy growing fast. But in the end, culturally and scientifically and intellectually, it was not seen as absolutely at the forefront of things. And so Flexner was saying, let us be more like Germany, let us be more like England, let's import the science in. What's happened over the 100 years is that we have become more and more scientific. And I would say, in distinction to science, we've also become much more technological. So they're related, but they're not the same thing. And so is it too much? Have we gone too far? In some sense, the answer is yes. And in some sense, the answer is no. We certainly don't have enough scientific evidence base for a lot of what we do. So we need more. We need a lot more. and this is intertwined with questions of commerce and sort of incentives and kind of drivers for changes in the practice of medicine and all of that. In some ways, we have stopped seeing the forest for the trees. My own view is that there is a sort of intellectual problem that's part of this, which is to say, we've sort of, I think, gotten trapped in a certain kind of reductionist paradigm, which I think of as the penicillin paradigm. That, we found this antibiotic, and lo and behold, it was like magic. And, it was it was like the answer. And we in the pharmaceutical industry, we, the professionals, pharmaceutical industry, society writ large thinks of drugs in general and medicine in general in many ways as a series of looking for the magic bullet, the penicillin. And I think when we get to chronic diseases, which are the diseases of, the modern lifestyle, they're multifactorial. They're based on so many different drivers and determinants, both nutritional and social, and all the various ones that I think everyone recognizes and understands. That the idea that there will be, a silver bullet has really, in some ways, led us astray. Now, I say that as somebody who would not necessarily have predicted the massive and generalized success and, shall I say, seeming success of the GLP-1 drugs, and the fact that, here's an agent that seems to have a set of pleiotropic effects across so many dimensions. But nevertheless, biology is complex. Our physiologic systems are complex. Signaling, humoral signaling electronic sort of all these things create an incredibly complex system. And the idea that a perturbation here with a drug or perturbation here with a device, can somehow lead to durable and really meaningful change, I think leads us too often astray. So my own feeling is we need a new paradigm for some of the science, and that's a whole other conversation. But, and there's a lot of interesting work that's been going on for 10, 20, 30 years looking at network theory and, dynamical systems and all of that. And I think medicine and the human body is sort of as good an exemplar of, a complex system as any in the universe. So there's a lot, we could be doing, but none of what we are doing, I think, in any way has trumped, so far at least, the desperate human need when someone is sick to feel like the party that you go to for advice is someone who you can trust, who's genuinely sort of has your best interest at heart, and to whom you hand over your fate. So that's a deep kind of a relationship. And we need to work on that, because I think our systems of care, the money, but all the other pieces of the systems of care and the bigness of systems have reached a stage where that's getting lost.
We can kind of have both paradigms existing in parallel or alongside each other. You can have particular surgeries or procedures or medications that work brilliantly in a certain area, but we can also recognize that our understanding of the human body, that it is a complex system that has non-linear relationships, that has emergent type properties that really push on our intuitions of assuming A plus B equals C. The science in healthcare is a bit more lumpy than we tell ourselves and tell the public, that actually we have great evidence in some areas and it's not so good evidence in other areas. And so there is this more probabilistic type of approach that gives us confidence intervals that can sometimes be really, really wide, meaning we're not really that sure, and very, very close together, which means, we're pretty certain this is the best way forward. And I think what you're pointing to is us, stepping back a little bit further to think a bit more broadly about the complexity of healthcare, but still grounding it in that human endeavor.
And, where the rubber meets the road is in the individual patient. that walks into your exam room because, I have an 87-year-old woman with some osteoarthritis, but, she also has a little tremor and she has a little this and she has a little that. And the question is, am I going to add this drug to the mix? And I look at what's the evidence show. And the evidence is a randomized trial. So it's the gold standard. Maybe it's hugely enrolled. So it's adequately powered, whatever you say about it. And that tells you, well, on average, it's a reasonable thing to do this. But the clinician's job is not to say on average, because it's not the average patient who walks. It's not the population mean walking into your office. This is 86. So what was the mean age of the population that was in the RCT? So then how many were at this age? And how many were women? And how many had this comorbidity? How many had that? And by then you're starting to get to a very, very low-powered inference about whether this drug is actually reasonable. That is, I agree with you. We need to have a certain humility. I mean, some of it comes from being a proper understanding of what evidence is and what it's telling us. And if you have that proper understanding, I think it drives this sense of humility, and you have to be therefore careful and cautious. And I think that, that's true every minute, which is why on the one hand, it's nerve-wracking, to make medical decisions for patients with patients. On the other, it illustrates that, there's some sense in which, at least so far, I don't think AIs are up to the task, or robot doctors will be up to the task. Maybe in 100 years, maybe in 500 years, we'll have the kind of android doctors you see in the science fiction movies. I think it's a ways off.
What I really want to underscore is the idea that sometimes not doing something, sometimes waiting, sometimes that aspect of caring is underemphasized, and that we can have this feeling of some sort of transaction of this is what I'm giving, this is what I'm doing for you. And sometimes patients expect that, and we've kind of built up maybe a culture of that expectation. You go to the doctor to get a thing, to get a referral, to get an investigation. Oh, I'm getting investigated for this, they're taking me seriously. And sometimes the hardest part of medicine is communicating that actually we don't think it's a good idea. We think it's worth watching and waiting. Now, the downward pressure from the need to be, quote unquote, productive, to have throughput, but then also the kind of upward pressure from seeing lots of patients, from being overwhelmed, from being burnt out, creates this really challenging space where sometimes it's just the easy thing to do. You sort of go, this is this condition, confidence in the science, they're wanting a thing, happy path, move that person through. And that actually creates more noise, more work in the system, more inefficiencies, because now that patient may have a side effect. Now they find a incidentaloma, something that was never going to cause harm. And this cascade now rolls off, and this person is now on this journey of a health experience that they never needed to have. I can see how that rolls into the idea of overuse. What's your sort of take there?
Oh, it sure does roll into that idea. I mean, I'm reminded of one of these statements that my mentor, Dr. Bernard Lown, used to make, which I think is sort of illustrative of his absolute genius. And what it was he said, in most areas of activity, efficiency translates as doing the same thing in less and less time. And he would say, but in the practice of medicine, efficiency increases the more time it takes. And I would say, what? Huh? What does that mean? And what he meant was effectively, and this is, I think, an important question for everyone trying to design delivery systems, think about incentives and all of the rest, is that given the deep complexity that you and I have been talking about the human being and the interaction, the relationship, and the practice of medicine. It's not really easy to pick out the one little thing that you can push that button and everything will be fine. You really need to take the whole picture in, and that's hard to do quickly. But if you take the time to do it, then you can often see, having looked at the whole picture, exactly what is or isn't, the appropriate thing to do. And that can become very efficient. So a friend of mine, Iona Heath, who's formerly the president of the Royal College of General Practitioners in the UK, she sent me an article coming out of Norway recently that showed, and there's other literature on this, that showed that longitudinality of the relationship between clinician and patient, the greater the longitudinality, the better the outcome. And these are hard outcomes. This was not some soft, questionnaire result. These were sort of hard clinical outcomes. And it's something that is probably, true much more widely than we realize or recognize. And the problem is that's a definition of efficiency that has long-term feedback loops. And medicine is not currently structured to have those long-term feedback loops be determining how we design our systems. The short-term feedback loops are less. Yeah, sure, if you have surgery and you have a bad complication, that's a quick feedback loop. You want surgery that doesn't have many complications. Unfortunately, we do that. We're kind of at a place now where we have to look harder for returns, and the simple stuff, the low hanging fruit, maybe we've achieved, but the harder stuff takes more time, and the transactional model you've described is ill suited for it. And so, we have people who run delivery systems, who fund them, who think about their budget and who think about how many people can get seen. And it's not like that's not important, but at the end of the day, what matters to all of us are the major outcomes. And so for that, longitudinality, a relationship-based system, would actually be more efficient. But in order to do that, we have to rethink, how we pay for care, how we reward care, what prestige means in medicine, a range of things. And so, again, paradigm shifts are really on the agenda, I think.
So if we were to go a little bit deeper on the overuse space, low value care, I wondered, how big of a problem really is it?
So it depends a little bit on how deep you're willing to go. If you want to look at areas in which there's really strong, incontrovertible data and a mismatch between what the data shows and what's going on in the world, I don't know what that number is. That number is probably significant. My definition of significant would be 5%, 10% of all care. The problem is there's a lot of stuff we do that we really don't know. We just don't have good evidence. And in that sort of bucket, there's probably another 5 or 10%. Some of this is really the story of science in general, and the progress of science. There's some debate, perhaps, of whether there is progress increasingly as we get it gets harder and harder to get reproducible results in science. So there's maybe even a crisis of reproducibility these days. So there are some open questions. But to the extent, we learn more things, we understand things better, just in a very simple-minded way. To that extent, there's stuff that we do that eventually we'll realize, why did we do that? And so it's a spectrum all the way from, right now, dude, why the hell did you do that? There's no evidence, to, gosh, 30 years ago, we used to do this, and isn't that ridiculous? If you add all that up, my sense, and it's really just a sense, I haven't done a systematic study of that, it's a big number. It's a big number. It's probably on the order of 20 to 30%. and the volumes of what we do, all the blood tests we do, all the EKGs we do, all the stress tests we do, being a cardiologist, I think of those, but, in every domain. And then there are lots of things we do because our delivery systems are just so poorly designed. There are lots of hospital admissions, at least in the US, that take place when they weren't necessary, but we have no alternative pathways. There's a lot of ER visits because we don't have alternative pathways. We don't have a easy access to primary care. We don't have neighborhood based, nursing and simple primary care of the kind that take care of 80% or 70% of basic medical needs. If we had all that, if we reconfigure the system with everything we know and everything we could do, there's no doubt in my mind that a lot of what we currently do would go away. And it's hard to die on that hill when you don't have the hard data. But, senior clinicians, people have been doing this for years and years and years. I mean, I remember once, the surveys will show people think, yeah, I don't do much in the way of unnecessary care, but my colleagues do, and it's something on the order of 10% or 20%. But I remember being in a room, early days when we were doing, in-person Lown conferences, and there are a lot of clinicians from around the United States, and say, how many think 10%, how many think 20, how many 30, how many 40? And I think that, there were some senior clinicians who thought half of what we do is kind of unclear benefit. So I think the answer is there's probably a lot, but that doesn't mean we could easily just lop it off and everything will be fine, because so much depends on what we know, what we need to know. Studies need to be done that aren't done, and systems of care that have to be completely redesigned in order to achieve the same results for much less in the way of testing and treatment and this and that.
There have been some moves sort of in this space to attempt to not quite lop all of it off, but sort of maybe shave the edges around things like choosing wisely, as well as certain medical colleges coming out with position statements on certain treatments and things like that. Have you seen any success or progress in that space?
There are inklings of it in specific locations, specific health systems, specific initiatives. You do see changes. You also see a lot of reduction of low value care without formal programs like choosing wisely, but with a change in incentives like global budgeting and risk contracts. But with global budgeting risk contracts, there's a high risk that you also reduce necessary care. And, one would like to think that isn't happening in the sense that if you structure it so that a clinician group is taking a risk and the clinicians are making those decisions rather than, an insurance company bureaucracy, you would be trying to reduce the unnecessary care and not skimping on the necessary care. But, one's hard pressed to know exactly how that's happening. I think what hasn't really been done is a systematic look at the intersection set, or to put it a different way, a concerted effort to combine multiple drivers of low value care into a single framework to see what you could achieve. And I'm of the view that if one did that, it would be astonishing. I mean, it would be absolutely astonishing what you would see in terms of getting the same outcomes with far less inputs. But it would be sobering because it would also require a willingness to go where it led you. And that might mean volumes of certain kinds of clinical services drop precipitously, and the ratio of specialists and all of that might have to change. And that's not something that can happen quickly or easily. So I think a sort of pure experiment to see how much could be done would be exciting, would require a willingness to go where it led you, might, if successful, and I think it would be, might lead to completely new blueprint for how to do care delivery, but would be enormously difficult to scale because of all the systemic pieces, that are resistant to that kind of change.
Do you see any policy opportunity in this sort of space? Because it is so complex, and policy can lead to unintended consequences also. Do you see any levers in that space?
I think the heart of it is really on the profession, both in how we teach, how we train, continuing ed. I mean, I know these are all sort of probably sort of cliches, but that's the heart of it. But I think there are things that the regulatory environment could do to create a grid for professional activity. In other words, I do think that, let me just give you an example. So the Lown Hospital's Index for Social Responsibility, we report out rates of a basket of low value services, and it's claims based. And, we have fairly good algorithms, and I think that, the results are very useful. But we don't claim that any given patient is exactly for sure low value care. We can't know that without viewing the record and maybe even interviewing the patient. There's so many dimensions to it. But I think directionally, we have it right. What I imagine, in the best of all possible worlds, the Lown Institute wouldn't be doing this. Somebody with some authority would be doing this. But again, I don't think we want a bureaucracy practicing medicine. We certainly don't want payers practicing medicine, whether it's the government or whether it's insurance companies. But the regulatory framework could be created so that it is the profession's responsibility, and the profession is self-regulating, as it is in theory now, but I think does a poor job. But if the regulatory framework said, look, there shall be such monitoring, there shall be regular publication and review of such data, and whenever there are outliers, there shall be peer committees that will review these matters, et cetera. There's a range of things that could be done at the regulatory level that's not the same as sticking your nose into the exam room. And I think, that might help, at least give more people the nudge. And I certainly think, the financial incentives could be structured in such a way, you don't necessarily have to financially penalize a specific clinical service event, transaction as you were described. You don't have to do that, but you could create a world in which compliance with certain behavioral patterns, like self-regulatory audits of appropriateness, for example, could be something for which the absence of which led to certain financial consequences. It wouldn't necessarily solve it, but I think it would again be a nudge in the right direction.
And so I'm glad we've started to talk about the social responsibility index, and specifically we've kind of been drilling down around the kind of overuse sort of space. But obviously there's a number of high level metrics around equity, value, and outcomes. Before we talk about a few of those topics, I just wanted to go back maybe one step further and just ask, putting the overuse, which is a big problem, to one side, why did you feel that this was something that needed to be done?
Well, the origins of this project really lay in the view that, twofold view. One was that mathematical methods, risk adjustment methods, and you can multiply that to the world of big data and AI, however you want to think of it. Things were moving along at a rate that meant we might be able to get somewhat better estimates of things like mortality readmissions. So that was one motive. But the other was the great sense of disconnect between a lot of what, other ranking systems, particularly US News and World Report, were reporting as being very self-serving in the sense of, They're based on reputations, they're based on surveys. Hospitals wage big campaigns with their own staff. I mean, they send out emails saying the survey's coming up. Please be sure to tell everybody and everyone, that we're the best and blah, blah, blah. We had a growing sense of a kind of disconnect between what all that was doing and what really mattered in terms of how we think about hospitals. So I think that was the origin, and that I am an aficionado of history. We also began to recognize that there had been this broad, sweeping change over time that was pretty consequential. At the time of Flexer in his report, I mean, I think there were maybe 6,000 or 8,000 hospitals. Most of them were very small. Most of them were either religiously affiliated, or civic associations that came together because we need a hospital in our community. And the physicians came and took care of patients in the hospital. They had their own practice. They came to the hospice, and that was that model. And then as medicine got more scientific, as more technology evolved, and then the broad macroeconomic trends that took place, certainly in the United States, but really all over the world after the Second World War, led to a boom in the building of hospitals, a boom in third-party insurance coverage. And what used to be kind of a communitarian small enterprise is now a massive, massive big business. That's a big business to take care of millions of people, but nevertheless a big business. And increasingly, especially after 1980 in the United States, there is a sense that market mechanisms could solve some of the weaknesses that were already beginning to become evident. And so there's a big kind of pivot towards that way of thinking. And unlike some countries, the United States treats hospitals, as a sort of individual enterprise that floats or sinks on its own, which is not wrong, but as a social enterprise, what it means is if hospitals have to find their own revenue sources and have to maximize their margins, in order to live or die, then the behavior, even of nonprofits, becomes oriented towards the bottom line. And so increasingly in the last 20, 30 years, that's what we've seen. We've seen it in many dimensions. We've seen it in the ratio of administrators to clinicians. We've seen it in the salaries and in the income inequality within healthcare, not just hospital CEOs, but even the highest paid specialties in medicine compared to the lowest. Sort of in all these dimensions, a market mechanism has kicked in. But the care and the quality of care and the safety and all of those things have not had a commensurate dramatic improvement, have they? So it was that disconnect that led us to start saying, look, we should begin to try to seek metrics or ways of looking that would give people, all of us, a different benchmark, different yardstick, so that we could light the way to doing things differently, I guess is how I'd put it. We're not doing this just to do it. We're doing it because we think if we can help change the norm of what it means to be a great hospital, we can all, begin fashioning a way for those hospitals to go in that direction.
And it might be a surprise for some of our American, but also international listeners to hear about how nonprofits can also be kind of caught up in some of the gaming of incentives. I wondered, could you tell me a bit more about what happens in that space?
This is the market mechanism. We've had a wave of consolidations of health insurers. Health insurers then have a lot of negotiating clout. We then have had a wave of consolidation of hospitals, buying up other hospitals, creating big chains and systems so they can have negotiating leverage. And, I call it, King Kong versus Godzilla. But quite often patients and communities get trampled in that fight because hospital consolidation is supposed to do various things, but the one thing it seems pretty clearly and consistently is that it raises prices, which is not exactly a shock or a surprise given what you might expect as things start getting more monopolized. But that's really been the trend.
One might assume, well, in the name, they are doing all of the good off in their own will. But my understanding is that actually the accountability for the doing good sometimes can be quite murky, and the behaviours can actually be more concerning than people realise.
So what happens is as you get that consolidation, you get bigness. You also get more of, I think, a corporate style and feel. The other thing that's happened during that same period and with those same trends is that boardrooms of hospitals are more business minded. The board members are less, local community people than more prominent business people in the community. Now, that was always somewhat true. But again, in the last 20, 30 years, there's been a trend to think that way. And, if every tub sits on its own bottom and you have to fight for revenue and you have to be sure you have your margins and all of that, then you have a world in which you think like a business and you act like a business. And so, so if you have a system in which, every tub has to sit on its own bottom, and everybody has to look for their revenue and keep their margins up to survive, you have to think like a business and act like a business. Most people in healthcare who know about this would say very hard to distinguish the behavior of nonprofits and for-profits. I think there are some serious important distinctions, and they're worth discussing, from the policy level, but in many important ways they're not. And the bigness can be quite breathtaking. I mean, there are hospital systems in the US that have billion-dollar hedge funds that are playing the market. Okay, we have hedge funds, and there are people with billions of dollars to play, but I wouldn't have thought that was what a hospital's mission was. And yet that's kind of where we've ended up. And then it interacts with all the other pieces of what we're talking about, because if you're going to behave that way, then you really want to prefer the high margin businesses. And high margin businesses may be more high tech. The evidence base may be less clear. Proton beam therapy is a great example where the evidence supports its use is a very narrow sliver of cases, but the deployment at scale is now such, and I think, in fact, private equity backed deployment at scale, that you have to get a return on that investment. You'd have to start using proton beams on all sorts of people and conditions where there's very little evidence. So the intersection and interaction of that with low value care can be quite clear. Not always, but sometimes quite clear. So when you get this kind of world and that kind of outcome, we really have to think about how do we turn this huge ship, this huge super tanker in a different direction that's more positive. And we're trying to do a tiny part with the hospitals index. We don't pretend it's going to do it, but we certainly hope that by raising questions and having conversations, more people will begin to see that we really need a paradigm shift.
As we round out our conversation, obviously we've articulated a number of really significant challenges and the space that you're working in to start to turn that ship around even just by a couple of degrees, which can be hugely impactful in the direction. What would you say to other clinicians or health professionals listening in about how perhaps they can maybe participate or start to contribute to these sorts of things? Because it can be quite easy to get trapped into the career that healthcare kind of puts you on those sort of train tracks. What advice would you say to them about how they can start shifting things a little bit for the better too?
I would say in historical moments like these, one cannot simply stick to one's knitting, however one thinks of that. I mean, it would be nice, in historical moments like these, that is a little bit of a luxury. One has to be thinking more broadly and more systemically. The issue and the challenge is really that within medicine, and I'm talking mostly about doctors now, but within medicine, there's a little tribalism as well. And so it's not like the house of medicine is all going to always be united. But what I will say is that these are trends, whether it's the income inequality, the rising medical debt. I mean, there's shocking numbers on medical debt, and I believe them. I don't think they're false. The number of Americans who are in medical debt is 15 to 20 million. But the number of Americans who've had some experience of having medical debt, subtle distinction, being in medical debt officially versus having some experience of medical debt. The latter group means they had to use a credit card, they had to go to a friend, or they went to family members. Now you're approaching 100 million people in the country. Trends like that are trends that cannot last. I mean, what are we going to do? Are we going to start putting people in debtors present, for health care? No. But where I'm going with this is that when things like this are going on and they cannot continue, the solutions that are on offer have to address, these glaring problems. And physicians in particular will do well to take up the cause of their patients. Because if they take up the cause of their patients will defend them. But if they don't take up, and this is, a genuine taking up of the cause of patients, this is not a, sort of a slogan about how much we love patient care and how it's important. If we do that, then it means that as clinicians, we actually have to partner with civic leaders, community leaders, others, to begin to look at alternative ways of doing things. And that may be outside the comfort zone of somebody who wants to stick to what they do in the exam room. That's why I went into medicine, because I knew that what happens in that interaction, whatever else is going on around me, there's something really deep and important and satisfying. And that still can be true, but the forces impinging on that are such that I think we have no option but to think more broadly, think more systemically, and try to help develop solutions. Whether it's a single payer system in the US, which is, perfectly logically reasonable, though politically, obviously, it's a big question mark, or whether it's, switching to different types of budgeting and payments. The political process, where I call it small p politics. I mean, today is election day in the United States, so God forbid I don't want to get into the middle of those kind of, debates, most of which I find, not particularly meaningful. But small politics, being invested in participating in the community and getting a sense of what that's like and what matters to the vast majority of people who are in need. And I'm not just talking about the indigent. I mean, the middle class in America is feeling the burden of American healthcare. We have to fix this. I think without doing that, having a shift in your sense of your own role as a professional and more engagement with, society, things aren't going to get better.
Sure. While the system problems are so large, actually our participation can be at the local and slightly smaller scale, and it still is very meaningful. And to sort of collaborate with our communities and our patients is the way that we need to shift what we feel is our responsibility as being clinicians and healthcare professionals. So I just wanted to say a big thank you, Dr. Vikas Saini, for all of your insights and your contribution to healthcare and work at the Lown Institute.
Thank you so much for having me. My pleasure.
And that brings us to the end of the podcast. If you want to go deeper about any of these topics or join in on the discussion, visit our website, clinicalchangemakers.com, or our YouTube channel. Finally, if you enjoyed our work, please give us a rating and share your favorite episode with a friend or colleague. Until next time, take care.